Hi, welcome to Widescreen Logic. I'm Josh Weber. Today we're going to dive into 3 things that work and 2 things that don't in the new horror film, The Last Thing Mary Saw, debuting this week on Shudder. This originally premiered at Fantasia Film Fest this past fall and came out with a decent amount of buzz, and I've been looking forward to checking this one out. My first impressions were something in the realm of The Witch by Robert Eggers and some other recent folk horror films. But interestingly enough, this seems to have leaned more into the religious underpinnings of horror. The story takes place in upstate New York in the year 1843, where the parents of a young woman named Mary, portrayed by Stephanie Scott, are seeking guidance from religious leaders as to what to do with her, knowing she is having a romance with their hired help, who is also a young woman named Eleanor, portrayed by Isabel Fuhrman of Orphan fame. The film follows Mary and other various household members as they slowly become consumed by this tragic romance and the fallout from it. I don't want to go too much further than that because the spoiler territory is real, so here are 3 things I liked and 2 things I didn't. Here's what worked. 1. Forbidden gay love. Eduardo Villoledi seems most concerned with watching this forbidden love take place in a time where there weren't even real terms to describe these relationships, much less acknowledge them as valid. I'm all for seeing queer relationships get on-screen stories, so I'm glad that Villoledi chose to place his story front and center rather than just allude or pay homage. Queer stories are just as deserving as those that are not, and I wish that more mainstream films embraced them. Number 2, great acting. Stephanie Scott and Isabel Fuhrman give great performances here in their respective roles as Eleanor and Mary, but they simply aren't given a lot of dialogue to work with, and much of the time they spend together on screen is communicated with looks. And while I can appreciate that the film is not overwritten, I wanted a little bit more from these two in terms of watching them actually come together. It reminded me of the Lizzie Borden film that came out a few years ago with Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart, and there too was a lesbian couple trying to navigate their relationship in a day and age where it was virtually impossible. I also found myself wishing there had been more dialogue given to them in that situation, so maybe this is just a personal problem and not the script itself. Roy Culkin does a great job in his role as the intruder as well. He proves to be an instigator of chaos in the lives of this family as well. There isn't much background given to him. His name is literally just listed as the intruder, and you never quite know what he's planning to do next. 3. Good use of setting. Villoledi also commented in his interview at Fantasia Fest that he went looking for whatever areas he could in upstate New York that hadn't been modernized because he felt strongly that the setting be a character of its own. And you can feel it here. He makes really good use of the area, trapping its characters in what feels like a very backwoods area where few, if any, people outside the immediate family pay a visit. It reminded me a lot of The Witch and how well that film isolated its family and made its woodsy area feel really dark and ominous. So here are the elements that didn't line up for me. 1. Pacing. The film as a whole comes in at a reasonable 85-minute running time. I don't know if you've been to the movies lately, but it seems like there's a mandate out that most need to be somewhere around 2 to 2.5 hours. And so I can really appreciate a film that will not just drag me out in terms of its running time, but parts of these 85 minutes unfortunately do drag. And I'm also not one that needs gore and intensity in my horror to keep my eyes constantly glued to the screen, but I really struggled to maintain interest in the family as a whole sometimes, and their dynamics didn't ever really feel properly set up. I didn't feel like I got a feel for Mary's relationship with her parents or really her brother, anybody else, other than the fact that clearly they're at odds with each other because of the relationships that she's having with Eleanor. We can tell that there is tension constantly simmering beneath the surface. But that tension doesn't really get a chance to rise as much as I wanted it to. And there are definitely some intense moments in the film between the family's matriarch and Mary herself, but there was never really a time where I felt the chills or I couldn't take my eyes off of what was seen. I'm all for a slow burn horror film too, but it didn't feel really like it was either slow burn or super intense. It just kind of fell apart. 2. Confusing mythology. In an interview with the cast and crew, the director, Vitaletti, revealed that the choice to set the film in the 1840s shortly after the Second Great Awakening was deliberate. He had been intrigued by the inconsistencies of religion and its tendencies to be weaponized against people, especially during that time. And he was also really interested in the apocryphal religious tales that didn't make it into the Bible, but would find their way into the everyday lives of religious believers. This is manifest by a book that Mary carries with her that tells of people committing sins, including, but not limited to, gay relationships and the damnation that it results in. Vitaletti clearly saw the overlap of folk magic and Christian beliefs at the time and wanted to make it his own with this movie, which I can admire. And there is plenty of historical material to draw upon. It's really easy, I think, for modern audiences to take for granted that not only was Christianity much more conservative at that time, but depending upon the people that you came across, the various sects, there were tinges of folk magic incorporated into those beliefs at the time as well. However, I didn't really feel like I ever got a good idea of what that mythology entailed, at least for Vitaletti, and by the end I was more confused than impressed by his work on display. I'm not one that always needs a tidy ending or with like a bow on top at the end of a movie. I can really appreciate films that trust me as a viewer to make my own interpretation of the art and form my own conclusion. And it's really why I like directors like David Lynch, because I know that whatever I'm going to get into, I feel like they trust me with it, and I'm going to be thinking a long time about it afterward. But I don't feel like that was what Vitaletti was going for here with The Last Thing Mary Saw. It seems like he had a pretty clear understanding of what he wanted us to glean from it by the end. But I really couldn't tell you what that is. It just didn't really add up for me or resonate with me in the end. The Last Thing Mary Saw premieres Thursday, January 20th on Shudder. If you get around to it, let me know what you think in the comments below.